Welcome everyone, thank you for coming to my talk, Composer 101. Just before I get into this, some history for you. So in 2013, so 5 years ago, the very first time I presented at a conference, a Drupal conference, was at Design for Drupal in this room. I was way more nervous than I am now. So I'm excited to be back here and speaking in this room again. So welcome, Composer 101. If you don't know anything about Composer, that's great. You don't need to know anything. By the end of this, you'll be, I'll say you'll be experts. I'm not going to guarantee it, but I'll say it. So a little bit about myself. My name is Mike Miles, and I've been working with Drupal for about a decade now. I've done everything when it comes to Drupal, from content entry, theming, site building, module development. Most of the time now I do large-scale Drupal platforms. I run the Boston Drupal meetup, which kudos to the community in Boston. We were able to raise money to be a Crimson sponsor this year, so round of applause for the community. And I do a lot of things related to Drupal. During the day, I work as the VP of Technology for a digital marketing agency called Genuine. Genuine, we're a full-service agency, and we make agile brands possible. So what that means is we use our full in-house services to develop brands that people love. So we have a video department that does production. We have digital strategists, UX, designers, development in experiential apps and touchscreens and interactive applications. And then our development team, which has many specialties, not just Drupal, but we have people who focus on front-end technologies and methodologies, people who use .NET technologies for clients. And then PHP, which mainly is Drupal work, is what we do for Drupal. At night, I run a podcast called Developing Up, which is focused on the non-technical side of being a developer. So anything that's not related to code, but related to a development as a developer. We're in season 2 right now. Dwayne McDaniel, who's at the Pantheon booth, he's in the next episode. That's July 10th. So check us out there. And if you want to know anything more about me, you can find me anywhere on the internet, MikeMiles86, from Drupal.org to Twitter to LinkedIn, maybe YouTube, Google Plus, if anyone uses that, if it still exists. So check me out there. Okay, so enough about me. On to the fun stuff. So developers, they're really fun, cool people. They're really fun, cool people when they get to build things. Right? All developers, how many people here would say they're a developer? Front end, back end, UX even. All right. Right? We love building things, solving problems. And a developer is fine writing as many pieces of code, as many functions as they need to support their project, to deliver value. We don't mind maintaining that. We don't mind updating it to show how clever we can be. Every developer likes doing that. Developers, though, they start to get a little less joyful when they have to start using other people's code. Not because you're envious because someone beat you to the solution, but because you have to maintain something that you don't control, that you don't necessarily know how it works without spending time to investigate it. So it's just a little extra effort that takes you away from doing what you love, which is building something. Never mind when you rely on someone else's code that then relies on somebody else's code, or you have 2 libraries that you want to use that each depend on a third library, but maybe different versions, and then you have to spend a lot of time managing third-party code that you don't control, that may be buggy, that may cause problems. Not even to mention if there's a security update on a dependency you have, then you have to spend so much time debugging it and figuring out how to update it without breaking what you're building. Developers don't like that. I'm going to go out and say, we want to do this first level and build things. Now, a fundamental truth of every project that a developer works on, no matter if it's internally or externally, it has a limited time and budget. You need to build something, deliver it by a certain time point. You have a certain amount of money you can spend on it, whether it's resources or your client's paying you. So the more time developers have to spend maintaining third-party applications or third-party pieces of code, the less time they have to build something that's delivering actual value to the project. So in PHP projects such as building something in Drupal, how do you accommodate for this? How do you remove that burden from your developers so they can focus on building what delivers value, building what you control, whether that's building your theme, building your front end, building your back end. Composer. So Composer is a PHP package management system, or a dependency manager, that handles the third-party project code in your for this use case, we'll say Drupal projects, so you don't have to. So as a developer, you could just spend your time on what you love doing, building solutions, building that custom code that's going to differentiate your product and deliver value to your organization, your client, your website. So what I'm going to talk about today is, one, I'm going to explain the benefits of using Composer on a Drupal project, so on a PHP project. I'm going to outline the basic structure that every Composer project models itself after, including Drupal, and talk about how you get Composer set up for your project, for your machine. Then I'm going to demonstrate basic Composer commands. So there are really just 5 Composer commands you need to know to master Composer. We're going to go through each one of those, and you're going to see how basic they are and how you can take them away and provide value and use Composer to manage your code for you. So the benefit of using Composer is that you're the happy developer. You want to just focus on your code, not that third-party code that you may depend on. So you say, hey, Composer, I need all these dependencies. I need these other libraries. Can you handle them for me? And Composer's like, I got you. I'm going to handle all these dependencies. I'm going to keep them all organized and make sure all your versions work together. I'm going to apply security updates when you tell me to. You don't have to do any of that. You just have to know how to talk to Composer using a couple commands, and it manages X number of external libraries for you and for your project. For things like Drupal, this comes into play if you're using other themes, if you're using other modules. If those modules are using third-party libraries, Composer is going to handle all that dependencies so that you don't have to worry about it. You don't have to spend time or money on doing that yourself. You let the computer do it for you. Now, every Composer project is set up relatively the same way with these, what I call 3.5 items. So you have the composer.json file. Well, you have the composer.far file, which is the PHP archive. Composer itself is a PHP executable. You can have that in your project. You may not. I'll get into that in a moment. You have the composer.json file, which is a JSON schema file that tells the metadata about your project for yourself and your team, as well as it describes to Composer what your requirements are for third-party pieces of code for your project. Composer.lock, it's also a JSON file, but it's used only by Composer. It should not be touched by a human being. And what it does is it lets Composer keep track of all the dependencies your project has and what versions it's using and how they work together. And then the vendor directory, which is where Composer keeps all that code so it doesn't get intertwined with all your custom code. This is how every project in Composer is set up at the very basic. Things like Drupal add a couple more layers to it, but this is majority of how it works if you're using any type of PHP project that uses Composer. For security reasons, a secure Composer project has all these Composer items above your web root. So in Drupal, this is typically the doc root, where then inside there you have Drupal core, you have your modules, you have your themes. And the reason why you have all this above your web root is because Composer is going to be used for managing all your third-party code. Again, when you use Composer for this, you're not necessarily going to know how that code is structured, how it's built, what vulnerabilities there may be, how it could be used as an attack vector. If it's in your web root, it's web accessible. That means if an attacker is clever enough, they could use, say, PHP unit to run some test that somehow grants them access to your server. I don't know if that's possible, but it could be. If you have it outside your web root, it's not web accessible. The code is still usable by anything that's accessible to the web, but no attacker can access any third-party code that you don't control because it's outside your web root. So secure project structures for Composer, you're going to see everything related to Composer above the web root of your project. Now installing Composer, again, it's a PHP archive file, it's a PHP executable. It can be installed a couple of ways. If you're on a Windows machine, which I see some people here have Windows machines, Composer, its website, which is getcomposer.org, has an executable that you can download. It's a Composer setup file that'll help you get Composer set up on your machine locally. They make it really easy because I know Composer can be, Windows can be a little tricky with paths and how you set that up. For any other system, Linux, Unix, or OS X, they have a page on their website where you can download Composer, and they give you the steps to do that. You can follow these steps for Windows also if you're like a power user and you really want to control it yourself. And how you install Composer is one of two ways, either globally or per project. So this is why I say your Composer project has 3.5 files, because the executable file can be part of your project or not. And there are pros and cons for doing this. If you install Composer globally on your system, that means no matter what project you have, you can run Composer for it. You can use Composer across your projects. You can switch between projects, use Composer. You can set up command aliases. So you just type the word Composer in your terminal, and you can use it and run it. The downside of that is that depending when someone installs Composer on their machine, your team's going to have different versions of Composer. Depending when you go back to an older project, you may be running a different version of Composer than when that project was set up. This just introduces variability that may cause a problem of, well, it works on my machine and not on yours. Setting up per project is by having the archive file in your project directory. And what this does, it means that you only have to set up Composer once for the project, and anyone who gets, say, your Git repository has Composer already easy to go. They don't have to install it in their system. It also means that that version of Composer stays with that project, so you don't have to worry about if you upgrade it, not everyone's going to get the upgrade, that the project's not going to work. The downside is it takes a couple more keystrokes to use Composer, but I mean, come on. Composer's saving you a lot of time, so you don't have to be that lazy. I recommend per project. That's what I like to do, but it's up to you, and it's up to your team. Now, installing Composer, I'm going to actually take you through it right now, as long as the Wi-Fi doesn't crap out on me. It's quite straightforward. So on the Get Composer website, they have, I went to it, it's getcomposer.org/download. So what they have on their website is 4 PHP commands that you run inside your terminal that will download Composer for your project and give you that executable file. So all you have to do is come to this website, and every time you want to set up Composer on a machine is copy these 4 steps. And I recommend coming here and using these steps and not just getting Composer once and then passing it along, because of the second step, which has a hash check to make sure the file you downloaded is the valid version of Composer. So I'm going to copy this first line. I'm going to go to my terminal. So I am in a directory I created. It's called C101D for Composer 101 demo. It's empty. I'm going to run this PHP script. It's going to download the Composer setup file. Go back to Composer's website. I'm going to copy this hash check to make sure I downloaded the correct file, that there is no man-in-the-middle attacks with it. Okay. So what happened here is I ran a PHP script that just checked the hash of the file that I downloaded. If it was valid, it said, hey, installer is verified. If it was invalid, it would delete the file and say this wasn't a valid file. But it's good to go. And then I'm going to copy the third command, which removes the setup, which actually runs the setup. So what this is going to do, can I copy it? There we go. So what this command is going to do is now it's going to run the Composer setup.php. And what this does is it checks your system to see if you have PHP set up with the necessary dependencies. If you don't, it's going to tell you, hey, you need these things installed. You need this minimum version of PHP installed in your system. But if it works, it's going to say, great, I've installed Composer. You can run it by typing php composer.far. So if I look in my directory, we have the composer.far file. It downloaded the executable because my system met the dependencies. And the final command is just to delete that setup file. You don't need it. You only need it to get the executable. So I'll run that. Clear this. So you can see in my directory now I have composer.far. If I type php all right, php composer.far, and now I have Composer for this project. I can add this executable to my this archive file to my Git repository, push it up. Anyone on my team will now have Composer for this project. So that's how you install it per project. If you want to install it globally, just once on your system, same steps. Just one more thing you do is that you're going to move that PHP archive file to a directory that is accessible by your path. I'll be honest, I don't know how you do this in Windows. That's why you should use the executable. But on Mac, you can just do a move command. So I'm going to move composer.far to user bin local local, I think it is. Oh no, just user bin. It's user bin composer. I'm going to move it there. It's going to create an alias. What? Move composer.var to user bin. I'm typing this in wrong, aren't I? All right, I forget what the command is. Anybody know what it is? User bin. Yeah, show me all the.
I think you have to be inside local.
Is it local user?
User bin local and then whatever.
All right, clear. All right.
I thought it was user local bin. I'm checking.
What is the clear command? Okay.
Yeah, it's user local bin.
It is user local bin. All right, let me try one more time and then we'll move on. I'm going to user USR local bin composer. Thank you. Okay, I moved it. Yay. All right, so now my project directory doesn't have anything in it, but now I can just type the command composer, and there we go, I have composer. And I can do this from any directory. So if I cd out of here, I can now run composer. So I can use composer across any project, and it's accessible. So that's installing composer, copying a couple steps from their website, using the installer for Windows, and then determining with your team for your project if you want it in your project or globally. So you have composer installed. How to use it? Well, you need a composer.json file to tell Composer about what your project is about, the metadata, the requirements. If you know JSON schema, you can write this out yourself by putting some attributes that you need, such as the name, description, the type, the requirements. But you can have Composer do this for you. Again, you're going to use Composer to manage this code. Let it build this file for you so you don't have to waste time doing it. So I'm going to use the composer init command to do that. So the way you do this is you type composer or php composer.var init. And this is a helpful interactive guide that's going to ask you metadata questions about your project. Some you need, some you don't. So for example, the package name. It recommends using vendor and then the project name. I like to use client project. So for example, this would be D for D, C101D for Composer 101 demo. I'm just going to use shorthand. It's going to default to your computer's username and then your directory name. It's going to ask for a description. This is helpful for people on your team. My Composer 101 demo for the awesome audience. It's going to ask for authors. This is where you can add information about your team, such as their names and their email addresses. It's going to default to your logged in user, so I'll just leave that for now. It's going to ask for minimum stability. I recommend you leave this blank for any production projects. This means what versions of third-party libraries do you want Composer to download? Do you want it to download alpha or beta versions, dev versions? If you leave it blank, it's only going to download stable versions of code. And we'll get into that in a little later. So I'm going to leave that blank. The package type for your Composer projects, you're going to type in the word project. You can use Composer for generating packages to display on Composer and use with Composer. So use project. Any license information you may have, for example, Drupal uses the GPL license, so you can type in the GPL license or MIT. You can leave it blank. And then it's going to ask, hey, do you know any dependencies for your project already? If so, let's go through and let me find some. I'm going to say no for now because we're going to go in that in a further step. Same thing with, you can have dependencies that are just for your developers. So for example, in Drupal projects, if you use Drush or Drupal console, you can have that be a dev dependency so it's run on development environments and not in a production environment, and then it's available. But we're going to skip that for now as well. And then what it's going to show you is that this is the JSON file it wants to generate. It's going to ask you, let's say done here so you can see. It's going to ask you, do you want to generate this file? If it looks good to you, you say yes, generate it. And now by doing so, you can see in my project I have a composer.json file. Now if I open this up in Sublime Text, it's the exact thing it said it was going to generate. So it has the metadata for my project. I can add this to my repository, push it up, and the rest of my team gets it. Now, when you have this set up, you want to start telling Composer what dependencies you have, what third-party projects you want to use. And how the heck does Composer know where to find projects? How do you tell it that? This is where repositories come in. They come into play in the composer.json file. Composer references the web to find third-party pieces of code that you can use in your project. If you don't specify any repositories, Composer is going to use packages.org. Packages is the official PHP project repository for Composer. You can search for anything on here, and pretty much all the major PHP packages are available, like PHP Unit or Behat. Drupal core is available here, but not Drupal modules. Drupal has its own packages repository. So this is a good place to find any third-party code you need to use. If you want to add additional repositories, in your composer.json file, you add a repositories array, and then you give it, for example, of type composer. This is for anything that's set up to be a composer packages library. Packages is open source, and you can create your own private ones. For example, Drupal.org has its own packages for Drupal 8 and Drupal 7. So if you wanted to add Drupal modules to your Drupal project using Composer, you have to make sure you define the packages.drupal.org/8 Composer repository as a repository available. But you can use any version control system you want. So if you have a Git repository, say a private Bitbucket or a GitHub that you want to use for your project, for your agency, for your company, you can add it to your composer.json, give it the type VCS, and provide it the URL to get to that project. There's more advanced topics on the website, getcomposer.org, about how to add like private keys if you have a private repository and whatnot. So what this means is even though Composer is for managing PHP projects, technically you could use it for anything that is a Git repository. So if you have front-end frameworks you want to manage with Composer for your Drupal projects, you could use Composer for that with your own Git repos following semantic markup guidelines, or semantic versioning. So for now, we're just going to leave repositories blank. We're just going to use the basic packages. And now what we can do, since we know where Composer is going to look for packages, we can tell Composer what we require for our project. The require command is how you tell Composer, I require this third-party code for my project. I require this Drupal module. I require this theme. I require this random library that's going to do something for me. When you run the require command, it's going to affect 3 different files. It's going to affect the JSON and the lock file to keep information about that package, and then the vendor directory where Composer is going to store the code. Require can be run one of 3 ways. On its own with no additional arguments. That's going to provide an interactive search to find a package. You can provide it a vendor and package name, or then it's going to get the latest version of that package. Or you can provide it a package name and a specific version to get, and Composer is going to use that constraint to find a version that matches that. So I'm going to show all 3 of these. First, we're going to do just it without any arguments. Going back to our command line, if I run composer require, this is going to say, great, tell me a keyword to search for a package for. Now, since we're building a project and it's in development, it's always good to have logging when you're developing so you know what's going wrong. So I'm going to search for something that has log in the name. What Composer does there, when I do that search, it makes a call to packages. It says, hey, I need packages that have the word log in them. Package is going to return an array, and then it's going to show you the options. So let's go with option number 0, which is technically option 1 on the list, with monolog. That's a pretty robust logging system. So you provided the number. It's going to ask you, do you want to put in a constraint for what version you want? If you don't, it's going to get the latest one. So we're not going to put in a constraint for now. And now what this is doing is Composer is making a call to packages, saying, all right, I want monolog. Give me the information about it. It's going to get the version number, the latest version for monolog, and it's going to hold on to that and ask me if there's any more requirements I have. I'm going to say no for now. And so it's going to add this information to my composer.json. And you're going to see it actually downloaded 2 projects. It downloaded monolog, but in that information, monolog says, I depend on this other library. I have a third-party dependency as well for log. So Composer recognizes that and it downloads both. So if I go back to my directory, I look at it, I now have a doc lock and a vendor file. Composer created those when I ran composer require. If I look in my composer.json file, I'm going to see it added monologue with the version that it found to my requirements array. It didn't add PSR log because that's a dependency of this one. It's not necessarily a dependency of my project. And in the lock file, it has a whole bunch of information. It has a package array of its own. You'll see it has a specific version of monologue 1.23.0. It has the information about where it found that package, as well as what it requires. So it requires PHP 5.3 and PSR log version 1.0. And it has, where is it? It has that project as well, that package here as well, so that it downloaded. Now the log file, it's JSON. You can understand it if you read through it, but I'm gonna note that you do not edit the log file. It is created by Composer for Composer. It's not for human consumption. If you edit it, you're probably going to screw up your project. If you edit it and you try to update using Composer or install using Composer, you're going to break your project. If you just edit it and you're never using Composer again, the code's there, so it's fine. The third part of what was created was the vendor directory. So if I look in the vendor directory, whoa, what was that? LA vendor. You're going to see it has a directory for Composer, for Monologue, and PSR. So vendor is organized by vendor and then project. So that way if a vendor has multiple projects, it's going to be self-contained. Again, you don't really have to know the structure. Composer is going to handle it for you, but it's just good to note. So if I look in vendor Monologue, that's going to have a directory called Monologue. If I look in there, that has the Monologue code that then I can use in my project. Important thing to note about the vendor directory is don't commit it to your repository. Why? It contains third-party code that you don't control. As soon as you add it to your repository, you've checked in a version of that code. You now control it. You're responsible for it. You can still use Composer and maintain it, but you're putting code in your repository that you don't need to have there, that you don't need to maintain control of, that you can have any person on your team use Composer to help get, or any environment you're using to get, using like a build artifact, for example. There's some things for Drupal where you need to check in the vendor directory, such as Acquia. Steps to get around that, go beyond this talk. There are ways you can do that. So you have like your Git repository that doesn't have vendor. Use something like Acquia pipelines or Circle CI to generate a build artifact that has vendor, then checks it in. But that's beyond this talk. All right, so that's just Composer require. We'll do it with a package name now. So being good developers that we are, we want to unit test any custom code we write. So we like to write custom code. So I'm going to do Composer require, and I'm going to use PHP unit since I'm a PHP developer. So the vendor name and the package name. If you don't know this, search on packages.org for it. Do a keyword search, and you'll find descriptions about packages that may do what you want. What's that?
Not required.
Thank you. It's extra required. So I'm going to say PHP unit / PHP unit. Composer is going to make a call out to packages to say, hey, I'm looking for this package. Do you have it? Package is going to say, yeah, I have version 5.7. And it's going to download that. And you see it downloads a whole bunch of other dependencies that PHP unit has. PHP unit has a bunch of dependencies. I don't have to know that. I just know I want PHP unit. And Composer is going to handle getting all that other code for me. So now if I look in my vendor, I have a lot more code in my vendor directory, just Composer added for me. But my composer.json file, not my lock file, composer.json just had another line added to it. The project that I said I depend on. I don't care about its dependencies, I just care about that one. Final way to run Composer require is with a version constraint. So version constraints basically tell Composer, look for anything that matches its version number. Most packages use semantic versioning, which is major, minor, patch. And you can use any range of operators to tell a range to look for. So you can have the specific version, like 1.0.1. I want that specific version of this package. You can say, I want a wildcard, or I want a range. So I want anything that's greater than or equal to version 1.0, but less than the next major release, 2.0. You can say, I want anything that is version 1.0 dot whatever the latest is, using a wildcard operator. You can use a tilde to signify anything below the next significant release. So this tilde 1.2 is equivalent to greater than or equal to 1.2 but less than 2.0. This is usually safe to use because typically you can upgrade to minor and patch versions without breaking compatibility, but then major versions usually are restructuring, and you kind of want to investigate that. And then if you need to have something that's not stable, we talked about the stability flag earlier, I mentioned it. If you need something that only has a dev or beta release, for example, in Drupal 8, there's still a lot of modules that are in beta or alpha, but you kind of need them. You can pass a stability flag. So you can say, I want version 2.0 at the dev version, because there's only a dev release. I don't care that I told you I want stable code. I want this one to be a dev one. And Composer will use that. So to show how to use a version constraint, we download a PHP unit so that we could test our own code, but we want to test our users' behaviors. So let's use bhat, which lets you do that. And I'm going to use composer require bhat/bhat. And I want a specific version. So I want version 3.3.star. So anything that's below 3.4. I'm going to run this. Composer's going to take that version constraint, talk to packages, say, hey, I'm looking for bhat using this constraint. Do you have anything that matches? It's going to say, I do. I'm going to update compose.json with that constraint. And then I'm going to download the version that matches that and any code that it depends on. So it downloads, again, a lot of dependencies that I don't have to worry about. Now, one thing I haven't mentioned that you may notice here is all these suggestions. These are provided by the package providers that say, hey, I see you're downloading bhat. Perhaps you want to download Symfony console. Or perhaps you want to download the Symfony extension for bhat. Just guidelines that the developers of those packages are trying to help you be more robust. You can ignore those. So putting in the version constraint, if I look in vendor, I have a lot more directories in vendor. And my composer.json file just has that version constraint that I specified. That's what it's going to use. So great. I've downloaded packages. I've told Composer I require these packages for my project to work. I don't check in vendor, so how the heck do the rest of my team get this code? Because all the code lives in vendor. Well, you check in your composer.json, you check in your composer.lock, and then when someone on your project does a git pull and they get that updated JSON and lock file, they run, I should go to my presentation, they run the install command. So the install command will read the composer.lock file and it will download all the packages that it says it depends on and put them in a vendor directory. So this is great for new people that come on your project, that they just run composer install or PHP composer.var install, and it'll download all that code that you did when you set require. Now, some people don't check in their lock file. If you don't, what Composer is going to do is read the composer.json file. It's still going to work. But the issue with that is that if your lock file is not part of your repository, anytime someone runs composer install, based on your version constraints, they may get a different version of a package, unless you're saying the specific major minor patch version. So unless you say 1.0.1, not everyone's going to get that. If I download it 2 weeks ago, and there was a new release, you're going to get a different version of the code. Again, that leads to incompatibilities. So it's recommended that you make sure your composer.lock file is checked into your repo so that anytime someone runs composer install, Composer will download the same exact version for everybody on your team, no matter when they run it. Composer install can only be run one way, no requirements, just composer install. So to demonstrate to you how to use composer install, I'm going to do something a little funky. You won't have to do this on your projects. I have a vendor directory. I'm going to delete it. So now it's like I've pulled the Git repo, and all I have is composer.json, composer.lock. So if I run composer install, Composer is going to read my lock file, and it's going to download all the dependencies that are stated in that lock file. It's going to put them in the vendor directory. It's going to structure them in the way we saw by vendor and package. And it's going to tell me all the suggestions, which are a lot. But now, I have vendor, and it has all that code again. So that's a quick way for someone new to come on your project. You tell them run composer install, unless you're using some other tools on top of it, and they're going to get all the project code that they need, the third-party code that your project depends on. So once you've installed how do you tell Composer to keep stuff up to date? You know there's a security release that you want to update. How do you do that? The update command. The Composer update command, it affects 3 files. It affects your composer.json, your composer.lock, and your vendor directory. So what an update does is it reads your composer.json file, checks the version constraints, makes a call to your repository, says, do you have anything new that matches this constraint? And if it does, it downloads that latest version of the code, gets rid of any abandoned dependencies, adds more dependencies as needed. Then it updates your lock file and downloads that new code in the vendor. Update can be run one of 2 ways. On its own, it'll try to update all your third-party dependencies. It'll read everything in your require and your dev require arrays in your composer.json and try to update them all if it can. Or you can just say, I want to update a specific package using the vendor package name. For example, in Drupal projects, when a new release of Drupal core comes out, say it's a security release, you can say, Composer update Drupal/core, and it'll only update Drupal core. Or if there's a module you're using or a theme you're using that has a new update, you can type in that project name. And it'll just update that project and its dependencies. So I'm going to show these backwards because I don't want to update everything first. I'm just going to update one package.
Real quick question.
Yeah.
Corner statement. If you're using Composer in Drupal 8, that's always be very specific of what you want to update because you will run into problems left and right.
That is a good point. That goes beyond the scope of this talk. Drupal has some complexities to it where you want to be a little more careful with how you run update. But yeah, that's a good point. You should probably run it with package specific because then as you update one, you can test it, move to the next one, test it, etc. So to test an update, since I've been getting the latest versions of all these projects, I'm going to change bhat to 3.3 tilde 3.3. So what I'm now going to say is bhat constraint. I want to say this. The constraint is anything that's greater than or equal to 3.3 but less than version 4.0. So with this update to my composer.json file, I can run composer update bhat. So composer is going to read my composer.json file, see what version constraint I have, and then it's going to check my repository, so packages.org, for any version that's newer than the one I have installed that matches that constraint. You see it updates it. So it updated from version 3.3.1 to 3.4.3. Pretty simple to update. Now for updating every package, which if you're using Drupal, this is dangerous, but if you're using like just a Symfony project or any other simple PHP project, you could try to run this. This will update every third-party dependency you have. So to do this, I'm going to do some live on TV wonky things. So I'm going to change monologue. I'm going to make two changes. I'm going to set a wildcard constraint to a lower version. I'm going to remove my vendor directory. I'll remove my lock as well, just in case. We're on composer install. So it's going to give me an earlier version of monologue, just for demo purposes. All right. Look at all those suggestions. Great. Got me version 1.0.2. So now I'm going to go back just for the demo, and I'm going to change this constraint to, we're going to make it then greater than or equal to version 1.2.0 and less than the next major release, 2.0. I'll save this. And now I should be able to run composer update.
Could you have done that as a tilde command too?
Yes, I could have.
Tilde 1.2?
Yep. I'm running composer update, no package information. It's going to read composer.json to look at my version constraints, check packages for the latest versions, and it should update monologue, because that should be the only one that needs to update. So there it goes. It updates it back to 1.2.3. 1.23. So the final command you have to know for using Composer to be masters at it is the remove command. This is how you get rid of any third-party dependencies you no longer need. I find myself using this a lot when I'm working with Drupal when I want to test a module to see if it works for my needs. I do composer require, get the module, test it out. If it doesn't work, I do composer remove. And it gets rid of that module and any third-party dependencies it may have downloaded. So what this does is it deletes the requirement from your composer.json file, it removes it from the lock file, and deletes any of the code in the vendor directory. It'll also check any dependencies that that library had against all your other projects and see if any are abandoned, it'll get rid of them. If any aren't abandoned, if they're used by another package, it'll leave them in place. So it's very smart about how it handles the dependencies. You can only use composer remove with a package version. You can't just say remove everything. It won't do that. If you want to do that, just delete all the composer stuff. So I'm going to remove PHP unit. We'll just say I'm a smart enough developer where I don't need a unit test stuff. That would mean I'm a stupid developer, not a smart developer. So I'm going to do composer remove PHP unit / PHP unit. So this is going to check my composer.lock file, get all the information about PHP unit and any of its dependencies it downloaded, cross-check them against all my other third-party dependencies, and delete everything that is abandoned and not used. So you see it deleted a whole bunch of code from my project. I just had to type in this one command saying, I don't need this project or anything it depends on. So my vendor directory is a lot smaller, and my JSON file doesn't have PHP unit listed anymore. Composer removed it for me. Now I can push this up, and next time someone runs composer install, they're going to get the updates, or I think composer update. So great. Use remove to get rid of packages. Use update to update them based on your constraints. Use install to download the code. Require to find packages. What the heck do you do now? Everything else that you need to do for your project. Great, Mike, but how do I use this code? It's in vendor. Technically, I don't know the structure. How can I use this third-party code without knowing anything about it? Anytime you run a composer command to download, update, install, package, what Composer does is it generates an autoload.php file. This file uses PSR, I think 0, no, it must use PSR 4 or PSR 0. It uses one of the PSR standards for autoloading classes. So as you instantiate an object in your project, the autoload file will know how to find the files required for that and make sure they're included in your code. This is for PHP specifically. So for example, if I wanted to use Monologue, the very first package we downloaded, I can have a PHP file that says, I'm assuming this file is in my dev root, so I require anything, I go up a directory to vendor to autoload.php. I include that because it's above my web root. And then I can say, all right, I want a new monologue on line 1, monologue/logger. The way PSR works is the autoload sees that I'm trying to instantiate this object. It has information about how those class files, those PHP files are organized and when they exist, and make sure they're included correctly when I instantiate. So I don't have to know anything about the structure of the vendor directory. I just have to know to include autoload, and I can call any of the objects that I'm using for that third-party projects. It makes it really easy for me as a developer not to have to worry about, again, how that third-party code is working or be managing it, where I have to put it, where I have to put any dependencies it has. I just have to include one file, and then I can use it in my project. So, to recap, Composer manages project dependencies for you and your developers in your team, so you don't have to. So you can spend the time doing what you want to do, building the code that differentiates your project and delivers value. You can install Composer per project or globally on your machine based on the needs of your team or your agency or your clients. And Composer has 3 main parts. Composer.json, which is how you interact with Composer, tell it what you require, the information about your project for your team. COMPOSER.LOCK is how Composer keeps track of everything your project has downloaded and requires. And then the vendor directory where Composer downloads all the code. The 5 commands you need to know. Init generates composer.json for you so you don't have to write JSON code yourself. Require helps you find packages and install them. Install allows anyone on your team to download that third-party code. Update lets you update packages based on the version constraints you specified. And then remove removes any third-party code you're no longer using in any and all of its dependencies if they're abandoned. And then you use the autoload.php, which is found in the root of your vendor directory, to use those dependencies. With that, I have a couple of resources. So I have an annotated version of this presentation with recorded screens of the commands I ran at bit.ly/d4dcomposer. The getcomposer.org website has a wealth of information on how to use Composer, how to set it up, more information about how to define versions. And then packages.org is the place to find PHP packages, and as well as I think it has information on how to create your own packages, how to create your own packagist repository, and add that to your projects. So with that, we have time for questions and any feedback. I'm always welcoming feedback from my presentations on how to make them better, and I'll take questions after applause. All right, so I know that was a lot, so any questions?
That was good.
That was good. That's not a question, but thank you. Or maybe it was a question. It was good. No, thank you.
What's Composer 201?
Composer 201?
If you were to do a Composer 201 course, demo.
That would probably get into the more complex things about, for example, everything doesn't have to go into vendor. You can specify different package types can go in different places. So example for Drupal, you can say, if I want to download a Drupal module, I want you to place it in my modules directory. That would probably go in like a 201 session.
Also, what to do when Composer goes horribly wrong.
What to do when Composer goes horribly long? That's probably its own session, not its own. Composer 404. That'd be good. All right, if you have no questions, question in the back.
Is there a project too simple for Composer where it's just not worth it to implement it?
Is there a project too simple for not implementing Composer? I would say if it's something where you're not going to have to use any third-party libraries, like if you're going to write everything yourself from scratch, you don't need to set up Composer to manage that yourself. I would recommend, with the way code is structured now and projects are structured, and especially PHP frameworks like Symfony and Drupal, I'll venture, I guess, with WordPress, using Composer is a benefit because there's so many dependencies now that you don't want to waste that time managing it. So even if you're only having to use one library, why not use it so that you don't have to worry about updating it yourself. But if you're just doing everything yourself, you don't have to use it.
Would you use this on a not PHP project?
So, I mean, technically you could, right? Because if you tell it, I want to use this GitHub repo to manage, Git node libraries or something, you could use it. I've never tried it. I mean, because it's a PHP, so you still have to be able to run PHP, because Composer is a PHP archive file. But I don't think there's anything that would stop you from doing it. It's just built around PHP. I challenge you to try it out. It'd be interesting. Great. With that, I think we're just about out of time. So enjoy the rest of the conference. And thank you for coming. 2 rounds of applause. Awesome.